Before we start, a quick reminder to hit the subscribe button. Only 4% of my channel is subscribed. When it reaches 1,000 subscribers, I will release a special video.
Chapter 5. A Camp in Shadows. Beneath the heavy cloak of night, under the watchful gaze of a waning moon, Richard and Salen led their newly formed band of survivors through the twisted, silent corridors of a long-abandoned underground bunker. The air was thick with dust and the echo of distant memories. Here, in this hidden sanctuary, they planned to forge a resistance capable of striking back at the heart of Allrad's oppressive regime. The bunker, once a military installation, had been gutted and forgotten in the chaos of war. Its walls, lined with the shadows of the past, now resonated with a new purpose. Richard had stumbled upon it during one of his earlier scavenging missions, noting its strategic potential. It was remote, defensible, and most importantly, invisible to the prying sensors of Allrad's drones. As they descended into the heart of their new headquarters, the group felt a mix of trepidation and hope. Each step down the creaking metal stairs was a step further away from the oppressive rule above, a step towards something they could only whisper about in the dark. Salen took the lead in establishing order. Her background as a tactician in her own world made her adept at organizing groups quickly and efficiently. She divided the group into teams, each responsible for different aspects of their survival: security, logistics, medical care, and training. Richard, meanwhile, focused on fortifying their position. Using salvaged materials, he reinforced entry points and established a series of traps and alarms around the perimeter of the bunker. His human ingenuity paired with Selene's alien technology created a defense system that was rudimentary yet remarkably effective. The heart of the chapter, and the resistance, was the training camp. Salen and Richard took turns teaching their respective skills to the group. Richard's sessions focused on guerrilla warfare tactics, how to move silently, strike quickly, and disappear into the shadows. He used the bunker's maze-like layout to simulate attacks, pushing their physical and mental limits. Salen's lessons, on the other hand, were more exotic, involving the use of her species' advanced sensory abilities and environmental manipulation techniques. She taught them how to read vibrations in the air, a skill that allowed them to sense approaching enemies. She also introduced them to basic principles of her world's technology, devices that could temporarily disrupt electronic sensors, giving them an edge against Allrad's drone patrols. As days turned into nights and nights into weeks, the bunker transformed from a dilapidated shelter into a bustling hub of activity. The sound of laughter began to mingle with the clanking of metal and the murmur of strategy meetings. Relationships formed, as did a sense of camaraderie and family among the group. They were no longer just survivors. They were rebels, bound by a common cause. Their first true test came unexpectedly. A routine patrol around the bunker's perimeter turned into a skirmish when a scout team encountered one of Allrad's drone scouts. The encounter was brief but intense, ending with the drone being disabled and dragged back to the bunker for analysis. The incident was a wake-up call and a morale booster. It proved that they could stand up to Allrad's tech with the right preparation and spirit. That night, as they gathered around the salvaged parts of the drone, their victory was not just about the physical drone lying in pieces before them. It was about dismantling the fear that Allrad had instilled in them. Richard stood before the group, his eyes sweeping over the faces illuminated by the flickering light of makeshift lanterns. "Today, we've taken a step forward," he said, his voice steady and confident. "We've shown that we're not just survivors, we're fighters, and we're going to keep fighting until we take back what's ours." Salen stood beside him, her presence a silent affirmation of their united front. Together, they had turned a disparate group of strangers into a focused force of resistance. They had turned shadows into soldiers. As the group erupted into a chorus of cheers and applause, the walls of the bunker seemed to pulse with renewed life. For the first time since the devastation began, there was a real sense of hope, not just for survival, but for victory. And in the depths of their hidden camp, in the heart of shadows, the flames of rebellion burned brightly, forging a path towards an uncertain but unwavering dawn. Chapter 6. Ties that bind. The resistance base, a labyrinth of tunnels beneath the rubble of a forgotten city, buzzed with activity. This underground sanctuary, illuminated by the soft glow of bioluminescent plants that Solon had introduced, served as a beacon of hope in a world overshadowed by devastation. Richard and Celine, now not just survivors, but leaders, orchestrated the daily operations with a quiet confidence that inspired their diverse followers. In the command center, a cramped room lined with makeshift monitors and salvaged technology, Salin and Richard pored over maps and satellite images, their faces lit by the screen's blue light. They were planning their most ambitious raid yet. The target was a heavily fortified supply depot that Allrad used to distribute weapons to its forces. Capturing it could cripple Allrad's operations in the region, giving the resistance a much-needed advantage. Here, Richard pointed to a weak point in the depot's defenses, a rear gate that was less guarded during the shift change. We hit them here during the shift change. It's our best shot at getting inside without too much resistance. Sala nodded, her ice-blue eyes scanning the layout. And once inside, we'll need to move quickly to secure the armory. Any delay, and we'll be surrounded. The room filled with the murmurs of their team leaders as they filtered in for the briefing. Humans and aliens alike, each bore the marks of war but stood resolute and determined. Richard gave a brief nod to Salin before stepping forward to address the group. His voice, once uncertain in the early days of their partnership, now carried a commanding tone that resonated in the cramped space. As you know, tomorrow's raid won't be easy, but it's crucial. Not just for the supplies, but to show Allrad that we are not broken. We are not defeated. We are not defeated. We fight together, for each other, Richard declared, locking eyes with several of his team members, a silent promise in his gaze. The group dispersed with a unified sense of purpose, leaving Richard and Celine alone in the flickering light. They stood for a moment in silence, the weight of the coming day pressing down upon them. "You've changed," Celine remarked softly, her voice carrying a mix of admiration and concern. "You're a leader now, Richard. The people believe in you." Richard smiled wryly, his gaze lingering on the maps strewn across the table. "I had a good example," he said, meeting her gaze. There was a warmth there, a shared respect forged through countless challenges faced together. The night deepened, and the base quieted down as the rebels rested for the raid. But sleep eluded Richard and Salin. Both were too aware of what could go wrong. Instead, they spent the night reviewing plans and going over contingency strategies. Dawn approached with a grim inevitability, and the resistance fighters gathered their weapons and prepared to depart. Salin and Richard stood before their team, their expressions resolute. "This is it," Richard said, clapping his hands on his thighs as he looked around at the assembled faces. "Remember, stick to the plan, watch each other's backs, and we'll get through this." Celine stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "And remember why we fight. Not for revenge, but for a future where we all can live in peace. Let's go make that future possible." The raid was intense. As planned, they breached the depot during the shift change, using the chaos to their advantage. Salin led one team to the armory while Richard and another team created a diversion. Explosions rocked the depot as they fought their way through, the sound of gunfire echoing off the metal containers. In the armory, Salin worked quickly to secure the weapons, her team efficiently loading them onto transport vehicles. Outside, Richard's diversion was holding, but just barely. He ducked behind cover as a spray of bullets whizzed past, signaling his team to fall back. The retreat was messy, and not without cost. They lost good people, and as they drove away from the burning depot, the victory felt bittersweet. Back at the base, the mood was subdued as they mourned the fallen, but there was also a sense of accomplishment. They had struck a significant blow against Allrad, and their spirits were buoyed by the success. That night, as they tended to their wounds and counted their meager blessings, Richard found Salin looking out over the remnants of the city, her figure bathed in moonlight. He joined her, standing silently at her side. "We did good today, Salin. Thanks to you," Richard said, his voice low. Salin turned to him, her expression solemn. "Thanks to us, Richard. We're in this together, remember?" Richard nodded, feeling the truth of her words deep in his bones. Together, they turned back to the base, their resolve unshaken, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them in their fight for freedom. Chapter 7: The Turning Tide. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting long shadows across the resistance camp. Richard and Salen stood side by side, surveying their makeshift base. It had taken weeks of relentless effort, scavenging, and sheer determination to transform this abandoned underground bunker into a hub of activity. The camp buzzed with the energy of humans and aliens working together, a testament to their growing unity and shared purpose. As they moved through the camp, Richard couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The resistance had grown from a handful of survivors into a formidable force. They had conducted several successful raids, each victory strengthening their resolve. But the Allrad were relentless, and he knew their enemy would not remain passive for long. Richard, Salen's voice broke through his thoughts. Richard nodded, leading her to a secluded corner of the camp. Saleen took a deep breath, her gaze shifting to the horizon. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. How soon? Hours, maybe less, Salen replied, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Richard clenched his fists. We need to evacuate. But we can't just run. We have to make a stand, buy time for the others to escape. Salen nodded. Agreed. We'll need everyone ready. This will be our toughest battle yet. As the camp prepared for the impending assault, Richard and Salen moved through the ranks, giving orders and rallying their troops. Humans and aliens alike readied their weapons, fortified their defenses, and steeled themselves for the fight ahead. The air was thick with tension and determination. The first sign of the attack came as a distant, ominous hum. The Allrad drones, sleek and deadly, appeared on the horizon, their numbers swelling like a dark cloud. The ground trembled as Allrad ground troops marched in unison, their metallic armor glinting menacingly in the morning light. Positions, Richard barked, his voice carrying over the noise of the camp. The resistance fighters took their places, hidden among the ruins and behind hastily erected barricades. Saleen, with her enhanced senses, stood at the forefront, ready to signal the first strike. The Allrad advanced with ruthless precision, their drones scanning for any sign of movement. Salen's eyes narrowed as she waited for the perfect moment. Now! She shouted. A barrage of homemade explosives and energy weapons erupted from the Resistance's position, catching the Allrad off guard. The drones faltered, their sleek forms crashing to the ground in fiery explosions. The ground troops, momentarily disoriented, regrouped and pressed forward. Richard fought with a ferocity fueled by desperation and hope. Beside him, Salen moved with a fluid grace, her alien abilities allowing her to anticipate and counter the Allrad's attacks. Together, they inspired their fighters, turning the tide of the battle with their sheer willpower. But the Allrad were relentless. Wave after wave of drones and soldiers pressed forward, pushing the resistance to their limits. Explosions rocked the ground, and the air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and ozone. Amidst the chaos, a familiar voice rang out. Richard! Salen! It was Eric, one of their most trusted fighters, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. We've secured the escape route. The civilians are moving out. Richard nodded, relief flooding through him. Good, keep them moving. We'll hold the line here. As the battle raged on, the resistance fighters began to fall back, covering the retreat of the non-combatants. Richard and Saleen held their ground, their determination unwavering even as the odds stacked against them. Then came the moment they had feared. A massive Allrad war machine, towering above the battlefield, lumbered into view. Its cannons glowed with a menacing light, ready to unleash devastation. Richard's heart sank, but he steeled himself, knowing they had to hold on just a little longer. Saleen, we need to take that thing down, Richard shouted over the din of battle. Salen nodded, her eyes flashing with determination. I'll draw its fire. You find a way to disable it? Without hesitation, Salen sprinted towards the war machine, her movements a blur. The machine's cannons locked onto her, firing in rapid succession. She dodged and weaved, her agility keeping her just out of harm's way. Meanwhile, Richard gathered a small team and moved towards the machine's vulnerable underbelly. The ground shook with each step of the massive war machine. Richard's team worked quickly, planting explosives on its legs and critical joints. Now! He shouted, and the charges detonated in a series of deafening blasts. The war machine groaned and staggered, its legs buckling under the force of the explosions. With a final earth-shaking crash, it toppled to the ground, its cannons falling silent. A cheer rose from the resistance fighters, their spirits lifted by the sight of the fallen behemoth. But their victory was bittersweet. The battlefield was littered with the fallen, and the camp lay in ruins. The price of their defiance had been high. As the dust settled, Richard and Celine regrouped with the survivors. Their eyes met, a silent acknowledgement of the cost and the courage it had taken to stand against the Allrad. "We did it," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with both pride and sorrow. Celine nodded, her gaze sweeping over the battlefield. "Yes, but the fight is far from over. We've bought ourselves time, but the Allrad will be back." Richard placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll be ready. Together we'll keep fighting." As the sun set, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the resistance prepared to move to a new location. The Allrad had dealt them a heavy blow, but they had shown that they could stand and fight. Their unity, forged in the fires of battle, would carry them forward. The turning tide had begun, and with it, a glimmer of hope for a future free from Allrad's tyranny. Chapter 8: The Final Strike. The night sky was a canvas of stars, obscured by the thick, oppressive clouds of war that had hung over the planet for far too long. Richard and Celine stood atop a ridge overlooking the sprawling fortress of the Allrad's central command. The air was tense with anticipation, the silence broken only by the distant hum of Allrad machinery and the occasional crackle of static from their communication devices. Richard adjusted his night vision goggles, his gaze fixed on the fortress below. It was a fortress of cold steel and advanced technology, bristling with defenses that seemed insurmountable. But tonight, it would fall. Richard's heart pounded with a mix of fear and determination as he glanced at Celine, her ice-blue skin glowing faintly in the dim light. She met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the same steely resolve. "Are you ready for this?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Celine nodded, her hand resting on the hilt of her energy blade. "We've come this far, Richard. We have to see it through." Richard's mind flashed back to the months of preparation that had led them to this moment. The formation of their ragtag resistance group, the countless skirmishes, the sacrifices. Every step had brought them closer to this final strike. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the battle ahead. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. But it was the only way to cripple the Allrad's command structure and give their people a fighting chance. The resistance had managed to acquire crucial intelligence about the fortress's layout and defenses, thanks to the efforts of their spies and the sacrifices of their comrades. Richard and Celine led a small, elite team of fighters, each one a testament to the resilience and diversity of their alliance. Humans and aliens, once strangers and enemies, now stood united against a common foe. They moved with practiced precision, making their way down the ridge and towards the fortress's outer perimeter. The team reached the first obstacle, a high electrified fence. Celine signaled to their tech specialist, a wiry young man named Kai, who swiftly disabled the power to the fence with a series of deft keystrokes on his portable hacking device. The team slipped through the gap, their movements synchronized and silent. As they approached the fortress walls, the tension mounted. Richard could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins. They had one chance to get this right. He motioned for the team to take cover behind a cluster of debris as an Allrad patrol drone flew overhead. The drone's searchlights swept across the ground, missing them by mere inches. Once the drone passed, they moved swiftly to the fortress's main gate. Celine activated a holographic map, pinpointing the locations of key targets within the complex. "We split into two teams," she instructed. "Team 1 takes out the communications tower. Team 2 plants charges in the central power core. We rendezvous at the extraction point in 20 minutes. Understood?" Everyone nodded in silent agreement. Richard and Celine exchanged a final glance, a wordless promise to see each other on the other side of this mission. Team 1, led by Richard, made their way to the communications tower. They encountered several Allrad guards along the way, dispatching them with lethal efficiency. Richard's combat training and Salen's alien agility complemented each other perfectly, turning them into a formidable pair. At the base of the tower, Kai worked his magic again, bypassing security protocols and gaining access to the tower's control room. Richard and the rest of the team secured the area while Kai planted a virus in the system, effectively severing the fortress's communication with the outside world. Meanwhile, Salen led Team 2 towards the central power core. They moved through the maze-like corridors of the fortress, encountering heavy resistance. Salen's energy blade hummed with deadly precision as she cut through Allrad's soldiers, her movements a blur of grace and power. Her team planted charges around the power core, setting the timers to coincide with their escape. As the teams completed their objectives, alarms blared throughout the fortress. The element of surprise had been lost, and now they faced a race against time. Richard's team fought their way back to the rendezvous point, the corridors echoing with the sounds of gunfire and explosions. Richard's heart sank as he saw Selene's team emerging from the smoke, their ranks thinned but unbroken. Selene herself was at the forefront, a fierce determination in her eyes. They had done it, but their mission wasn't over yet. With the charges set and the communications severed, they made a break for the extraction point. Allrad reinforcements swarmed the fortress, desperate to stop them. The resistance fighters held their ground, buying precious seconds as Kai called in their extraction vehicle. A sleek, armored transport swooped in, its engines roaring as it landed amidst the chaos. Richard and Salen shepherded their team aboard, covering their retreat with a hail of gunfire. As the last of the resistance fighters climbed aboard, the charges detonated, sending a massive shockwave through the fortress. The transport lifted off, carrying them away from the inferno below. Richard looked back at the crumbling fortress, a sense of relief washing over him. They had struck a critical blow against the Allraid, but the cost had been high, and the fight was far from over. He turned to Selene, who was tending to a wounded comrade. She looked up at him, exhaustion and triumph etched on her face.
"We did it,"
she said softly. Richard nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Yeah, we did. But this is just the beginning. We've shown them that we won't back down. Now, we have to keep fighting, for everyone we've lost, and for the future we're building." Salen squeezed his hand, a silent vow of solidarity. Together, they looked ahead, ready to face whatever challenges lay on the horizon. The final strike had been a success, but the war for freedom and survival was far from over. And they would face it together, united by their shared hope and unwavering determination. Chapter 9: A New Foundation. The morning sun cast a golden hue over the scarred landscape, illuminating the ruins with a warmth that had been absent for far too long. The once devastated cities were now a hive of activity, a testament to the resilience and determination of the survivors. Humans and aliens worked side by side, their combined efforts slowly but surely breathing life back into the planet. Richard stood on a makeshift platform overlooking the bustling scene. His eyes scanned the horizon, taking in the sight of cranes lifting debris, people rebuilding homes, and children playing in the streets. The air was filled with the sounds of construction and laughter, a stark contrast to the silence and despair that had once pervaded the area. Beside him, Salen watched with a mixture of pride and relief. Her ice-blue skin glowed softly in the morning light, and her deep blue eyes reflected the hope and promise of a new beginning. She turned to Richard, her expression thoughtful. Richard nodded, his gaze still fixed on the scene below. "We fought hard for this," he replied, "and we've lost so much along the way. But seeing this, it makes it all worth it." Salen placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of camaraderie and comfort. "The sacrifices we've made won't be forgotten. They are the foundation upon which we are building this new world." Richard turned to her, his eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and determination. "You're right, and we owe it to those we've lost to make sure this new world is one where such sacrifices are no longer necessary." As they descended from the platform, they were greeted by members of their resistance group. The once ragtag band of survivors had grown into a well-organized force, now focused on reconstruction and ensuring the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. Among them were humans and aliens, their differences now a source of strength rather than division. The central square of the makeshift settlement had been transformed into a hub of activity. Stalls and workshops lined the perimeter, each dedicated to a different aspect of the rebuilding effort. Engineers worked on repairing infrastructure, medics tended to the injured and ill, and teachers organized groups of children, educating the next generation about unity and cooperation. Richard and Celine made their way to a large tent that served as their command center. Inside, maps and plans covered the walls, detailing the progress of the rebuilding efforts and outlining future projects. They were joined by their closest allies, including Jarek, a burly human engineer with a knack for problem-solving, and Thera, an alien medic whose healing skills had saved countless lives. "We've made significant progress in Sector 7, Jarek reported, his voice gruff but enthusiastic. "The water supply is almost fully restored, and we've managed to clear most of the debris from the main thoroughfare." Thera nodded in agreement. "We've also seen a decrease in illness and injury. The community is growing stronger every day." Richard smiled, a rare but genuine expression of satisfaction. "Good work, everyone. But we can't afford to become complacent. The Allrad may be defeated, but there are still remnants of their forces out there. We need to stay vigilant and ensure that our defenses are solid." Salin added, "And we must continue to foster the bonds between our people. This alliance is our greatest strength. We need to make sure that it remains unbreakable." Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger, a young girl with bright eyes and a determined expression. "Excuse me, Commander Richard, Princess Celine," she said, breathless from running. "There's a delegation from a neighboring settlement here to see you." Richard and Celine exchanged a glance before nodding. "Let's go meet them," Richard said. "This could be an important step in establishing a wider network of cooperation." As they approached the edge of the settlement, they were met by a group of humans and aliens, each bearing the marks of their own struggles, but also the determination to rebuild. The leader, a tall man with a commanding presence, stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'm Marcus," he introduced himself. "We represent the settlement of New Dawn. We've heard of your efforts here and would like to propose an alliance." Richard shook Marcus's hand firmly. "We're glad to meet you, Marcus. An alliance would benefit us all. Together we can ensure a future where our children grow up in peace." Salen smiled warmly at the delegation. "Welcome to our home. Let us show you what we have achieved together. Perhaps we can learn from each other and grow even stronger." As they led the delegation through the settlement, Richard and Celine couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The road ahead was still fraught with challenges, but they knew they were not alone. The spirit of cooperation and unity that had seen them through the darkest times would continue to guide them as they built a new world from the ashes of the old. And so, with determination in their hearts and hope lighting their path, Richard, Selene, and their allies forged ahead, laying the foundations for a future where humanity and alien kind could thrive together, bound by the strength of their shared experiences and the promise of a better tomorrow.